Our poem today is Binsey Poplars by Gerard Manley Hopkins, a poet of the Victorian era, but interestingly, not one of our very well-known poets. And that makes me stop to think about why do some poets make a mark while others don't? So when I think of Hopkins, I can't but think of all that he did in terms of newer techniques, newer ways of writing poetry, newer figures of speech maybe, and yet a difficult poet to understand. So he did have a sprung rhythm. I will talk about it later. But look back at a poem like The Wreck of the Deutschland and many more. And that's why it's important for lovers of poetry to read a poet like Hopkins. G.M. Hopkins, as he is better known, 1844 to 1889, was an English poet, but also a Jesuit priest. Sadly, he is believed to have burnt his poems as he considered them to be an obstacle to his religious vocation. In fact, many of his poems were later published posthumously. To begin with, they were published in anthologies, and the recognition did come to him. He was influenced by a poet like Christina Rossetti. You remember? D.G. Rossetti and Christina Rossetti. His parents were deeply religious, and probably that is what took him on the same line. He suffered depression in his earlier years. Well, that's about his personal life. What about his literary career? He wrote a series of what are now called the terrible sonnets. And why terrible? Because they all deal with and were a result of his melancholic depression. He did write poems on a variety of themes, but when we think of him, it's more because of his innovations in the writing of poetry. I remember a poem called The Wreck of the Deutschland. Well, the Deutschland there is not a reference to Germany, but to a ship called the Deutschland. So, Wreck of the Deutschland. God's grandeur, pied beauty, etc. are some of his other poems. He wrote for a long time, but remember, not a very long life, 1844 to 1889. Nostalgia is a common theme, not just in literature, but I think in all our lives. So can I call this a poem of nostalgia? He calls the poem Binsey Poplars, and then a little subtitle, Felled 1879. The word felled, I think all of us know, usually refers to the cutting down of trees. And in this poem, Hopkins is actually mourning the loss of a number of trees, aspen trees actually, along the river, which was his common walking route. And as I believe and always keep repeating, the best way to appreciate a poem is to read the poem. So can I begin by reading stanza 1 of the poem? Yes, indeed. What was felled, and how does he describe the felling? My aspens dear, whose airy cages quelled or quenched in leaves the leaping sun, all felled are all felled, of a fresh and following folded rank, not spared, not one that dandled a sandal shadow that swam or sank, on meadow and river and wind wandering weed winding bank. Oh, if we but knew what to do when we delve or hew, hack and rack the growing green. Since country is so tender to touch, her being so slender, like that sleek and seeing ball, but a prick will make no eye at all, even where we mean to mend her, we and her, when we hew or dwell. The first stanza itself, as we can see, I'm sorry, it was a longish stanza, but I couldn't stop reading because of the feel for words. You know, when you read a poem aloud, the onomatopoeia, probably the alliteration somehow gives much greater beauty to the poem. And that's why I continued reading. What is it? There is grief, there is sadness, there is anger also because we cut down the trees. But there is also a certain wistfulness, which I called nostalgia earlier, for things that have been but will be no more. So the innovation that I talked about in language also comes across beautifully. Yes, there is a love for the aspens because he begins by calling it aspens dear. And then look at the beauty of the language as the sunlight dances, right? I shall talk about the figures of speech again. Let me go on to the next stanza. And then he says in the third verse, aftercomers cannot guess the beauty been. 10 or 12, only 10 or 12 strokes of havoc under the sweet special scene. Rural scene, a rural scene, sweet, special, rural scene. Notice he's talking about how these trees have been cut down. But if you come later, that is, you didn't walk with me, he says. So if you come later, you will have no idea about the beauty of this scene. And he's sad that not a single tree has been left standing. Call it in the name of progress, development, scientific, maybe agriculture, maybe a new bridge, whatever it is. But along the river, the beautiful trees that he had once seen is no more there. The repetition of the words, they keep coming again and again. But what are we left with? A certain sense of anguish as the poem ends with a no possibility of returning to an age gone by. Usually, when we talk of the apostrophe as a figure of speech, it's a direct address to a person, thing, idea, whatever. But the poem usually begins with O. Notice in this poem, it's the second verse which has an apostrophe. He addresses the trees directly. There is repetition. Some people suggest that there is probably the Christian element of wanting to protect this earth from anything bad, anything evil. It doesn't say it directly, but after all, cutting down of the trees is there. There is onomatopoeia, the sound, of the trees being felled. You can see that. And with that, I have to add alliteration also. The fir, it keeps coming again and again. Yes, there are people who suggest that he was deeply affected by the Industrial Revolution. And that's one more reason for the thematic concerns in this poem. There is what is called rhyme, we all know, where the last word of succeeding lines, they rhyme with each other. But here there is something which is called the internal rhyme, quelled, quenched. When those words come again and again, as you read them, you can feel the rhyme and a certain rhythmic movement also, which we call, in Hopkins' case, the sprung rhythm, which is really a very, very innovative, unique meter. I want to mention his ability to create new words. I don't know whether I can call it a figure of speech, but he has words like unselved, right? We know the self, but the unselved is a new word. Read the poem once again to see how Both matter and manner combine to make it a wonderful poem. A poem appeals to me. Yes, I must admit, when I read a poem the first time, it is the thematic concerns that strike me. Because I think when I read the poem the first time, maybe I don't read it aloud. And then I tell myself, what is a poem if I can't appreciate the sounds of the poem? And then I pick up the poem again. And remember, I'm old-fashioned enough to believe that I need a paper in my hand if I want to really appreciate poetry. So I pick up the book again. I don't read on a tablet. So I pick up the poem again and I read it aloud. And as I read Hopkins, how can I not be moved by the sounds of the poem?